Hi, my name is Ashley, and I'm 29 years old. Until recently, I thought my life would always stay quiet and predictable, the kind of life people barely notice. I lived alone in a small apartment in Burlington, Vermont, where my world revolved around routine, opening up the bookstore downtown where I worked, shelving new titles, chatting with regulars, and then walking home through streets lined with falling leaves. My apartment wasn't much, but it was mine, filled with thrift store armchairs, old postcards pinned to the walls, and more plants than I could really take care of. I liked the silence, the stillness, the kind of evenings where the loudest sound was the wind off Lake Champlain rattling the window panes. Nothing about my life suggested upheaval or drama, but that all changed with one envelope. It was late October, and the cold bite of winter was already in the air. When I came home that evening, my feet ached from standing behind the register all day, my hands still marked with faint smudges of newsprint from unpacking boxes. I bent to collect the usual pile of junk mail scattered on the rug, pizza coupons, a utility bill, some flyer for a yoga class. But resting neatly on top was an envelope that stopped me cold. My name, Ashley West, was written in a familiar, looping script I knew instantly. It was my grandfather William's handwriting. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. He had been gone for 3 months, yet seeing his letters brought him back in a flood of memory. The scent of pipe tobacco, the sound of him humming in the garden, the warmth of his hug. The envelope was heavier than ordinary mail, the kind of paper you buy for things that matter. My hands trembled as I carried it into the kitchen and sat down at the small table, the late sunlight turning everything a mix of gold and blue. For a long while, I just stared at it, afraid to open it, as if the weight of his absence pressed down with the seal. Finally, I took a deep breath and slid a butter knife under the flap. Inside was a folded stack of documents, and on top his note. His voice filled my mind as I read, steady, gentle, teasing the way only he could be. My dear Ashley, if you're reading this, it means my time here is finished. Don't think of me as far away. I'm under the apple tree in the yard, watching you read this. Take a breath, sweetheart. Be brave. As I read on, my heart pounded harder. What he explained was what I had both hoped and feared. He had left me everything. The house on Fern Hill, the land, the savings he and Grandma once shared, though now, in this retelling, it was his alone. Even his beloved coin collection. Every word in the will was clear and direct. It was all in my name. I leaned back in my chair, the letter trembling in my hands. The responsibility felt enormous, overwhelming. I wasn't the kind of person who inherited estates or carried family legacies. I was the quiet one, the reliable granddaughter who fetched groceries, sat with him during long afternoons, and listened when no one else had time. Now, suddenly, I was at the center of everything. And even as tears blurred the page, a shadow of dread crept in. I knew exactly how my mother, Linda, and my sister, Jessica, would react once they found out. I couldn't ignore the unease building in my chest. The house on Fern Hill wasn't just a property. It was history, memory, and no small amount of financial worth. I knew my grandfather's choice would never sit well with the rest of my family. My sister Jessica had always been restless, convinced she deserved more than she ever actually earned. While I chose a steady, quiet life in Vermont, she leapt from one idea to another. Business ventures that fizzled, jobs in New York that ended badly, friendships that collapsed under her ambition. Whenever we spoke, she carried this subtle air of superiority, as if my small-town existence was something to be pitied. And then there was my mother, Linda. She lived in Boston, sharp-tongued and endlessly critical, especially of me. She had never truly forgiven me for turning away from the fast-paced city life she valued. To her, choosing simplicity was the same as failure. I could already imagine her reaction when she discovered the inheritance, accusations, manipulation, a barrage of guilt. She would see my grandfather's decision as an insult, as if his love for me somehow robbed her of what she believed she was owed. The thought of their voices, their pressure, made me want to shove the letter in a drawer and forget I'd ever opened it. But then I thought of my grandfather's faith in me. He had trusted me, believed I could protect what mattered. I owed him that much. So the next morning, I called an old family connection, Catherine Reed, the lawyer who had handled my grandfather's affairs for years. I remembered her well. Neatly dressed, calm, with a voice that always managed to untangle complicated things. When I stepped into her office above a bakery in Montpelier, the air smelled of cinnamon and coffee. She greeted me with a firm handshake that steadied my nerves. Together, we went through every page of the will. Her words came like a bomb. The documents were ironclad. My grandfather had left no loopholes. Everything was legally mine. Still, Catherine warned me how quickly families could turn against one another when money was involved. She suggested transferring all assets into a trust, with me as the sole trustee. I agreed, though the process wasn't cheap. Her fee alone was $4,000, a painful withdrawal from my savings. I hesitated as I signed the check, but I knew it was necessary. If anything went wrong, if my mother or sister tried to contest, the trust would shield me. By the time I left her office, a sliver of confidence had replaced some of the fear. Yet the weight of it all still pressed heavily on me. Driving to Fernhill that evening, I gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, the winding Vermont roads blurred with late autumn frost. The house loomed ahead, its porch shadowed, its windows empty. My chest ached with both grief and gratitude as I stepped onto the wooden boards, the key cold in my hand. The silence inside was thick, broken only by my footsteps on floors I had once raced across as a child. Every room carried the ghost of my grandfather, his laughter in the kitchen, his whistle in the garden, his coins laid out neatly on the study desk. That night, I slept in my old bedroom under a quilt stitched years ago, the wind rattling the window panes. For the first time in months, I felt both deeply alone and strangely safe. I promised myself, as I drifted into uneasy sleep, that I would protect what he had given me. No matter what storm came next. The first few days in the house blurred together, a strange mix of comfort and unease. Mornings began with cold drafts slipping through the windows, and nights ended with the groaning sound of old radiators struggling to keep up. The house was beautiful, yes, but it was also ancient, demanding care and patience I wasn't sure I had. I discovered the quirks quickly, which stair creaked no matter how lightly I stepped, which doors refused to close, which floorboards sang under my weight. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, I walked into the kitchen and found a slow, steady drip falling into a bowl I had left out. A leak in the ceiling, my first real battle with the old house. I stood there, glaring at it as if my frustration could will it away. Of course, it didn't. My hands were soon coated in plaster dust as I clumsily tried to patch it. The fix didn't hold, and I ended up with more water on the floor than before. Exhausted and sticky with failure, I had just set the mop aside when the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the empty house, startling me. I froze, dust rag still in hand, heart thudding in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone. Catherine had promised to call before coming, and the neighbors had been polite but distant, which left only one possibility: family. I wiped my palms on my jeans and walked toward the door, bracing myself. Nothing could have prepared me for the sight of Jessica standing there, a suitcase at her side, a wide smile spread across her face. She looked polished as always, her hair perfectly swept back, her eyes sharp and assessing. But behind her easy grin, there was something hungry, something that made my stomach tighten. "Ashley," she said brightly, arms opening as if this were a joyful reunion. "Look at you. It's so good to see you." Before I could react, she pulled me into a hug, too tight, her hands pressing against my back in a way that felt less like affection and more like searching for hidden pockets. I forced myself to smile and step back. "Jessica," I managed. "This is a surprise." She shrugged as if it were nothing. "I figured you could use some company out here. Plus, we've got a lot to talk about." Her eyes flicked past me into the hallway, scanning the dust, the boxes, the dim light filtering through the curtains. I didn't have to ask how she knew I'd inherited everything. News traveled fast in my family, especially when money was involved. Out of habit more than desire, I stepped aside to let her in. She set her suitcase down with a practiced ease, immediately commenting on the size of the house, how much work it must need, how expensive it would be to maintain. Her voice was like static, constant, grating, reminding me of every criticism she'd ever thrown my way. We ended up in the kitchen, where the damp ring on the ceiling still glistened from the leak. Jessica tilted her head, smirking. "Old houses are charming," she said, "but they're also money pits. Good thing you've got some funds now, right?" I ignored the jab and busied myself with making tea. My hands shook slightly as I lined up mismatched mugs on the counter. "So," I asked, keeping my tone even, "how long are you planning to stay?" She smiled sweetly, the kind of smile that made me distrust every word before it was even spoken. "Oh, just until Mom gets here. She's driving up tomorrow. She said she wants to help you settle in. She's got some ideas." My stomach dropped. Ideas from my mother were never harmless. They were demands disguised as concern, control wrapped in silk. The storm I had feared was arriving sooner than I thought. The next morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of Vermont day where the sky seemed to press down on the earth. I wandered the halls, still uneasy after Jessica's surprise arrival. I found her in my grandfather William's old study. The door cracked open, papers scattered on the floor. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Jessica glanced up, unbothered, and flashed a quick grin. "Just looking for some things I might have left here years ago. Remember those old board games?" I'm sure I stashed a few. Her tone was casual, but I didn't believe her for a second. She had never cared about the things that carried meaning in this house. Whatever she was digging for, it wasn't games. I bit my tongue, unwilling to ignite an argument just yet. By noon, the house echoed with the thud of her music playing too loudly from her phone. I tried to ignore it, scrubbing the kitchen floor to distract myself, but my own thoughts kept circling back to the dread I'd carried ever since the letter. That dread doubled when my phone buzzed with a string of messages from Linda, my mother. She was on her way, complaining about traffic, demanding groceries, reminding me that I couldn't possibly manage a place like Fern Hill alone. When her car finally crunched up the gravel driveway late that afternoon, I watched from the window, bracing myself. She stepped out wrapped in a tailored gray coat, her hair perfectly styled despite the long drive. She climbed the porch steps as if the house already belonged to her. The front door swung open before I could reach it. "Ashley," she said, pulling me into a perfunctory hug that smelled of expensive perfume and winter air. She didn't even pause before her gaze swept across the foyer, assessing everything from the worn floorboards to the high ceilings. "You look tired," she said briskly. "Are you sleeping enough?" I opened my mouth to respond, but she had already moved on, her eyes sharp and restless. She dropped her purse onto the table, shrugged off her coat, and handed it to me as if I were staff. "I'm doing fine," I said, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. She tilted her head, unimpressed. "Well, you don't have to do it alone. That's why I'm here. We can make a plan." She breezed through the rooms with Jessica trailing behind her, both of them firing off questions and criticisms as if rehearsed. Shouldn't the roof be inspected? How was I planning to afford the heating costs? Had I even thought about the property taxes? Each remark came less like concern and more like accusation, as if I were reckless just for holding on to what my grandfather had given me. Finally, they settled in the living room. My mother perched on the edge of the sofa, posture perfect, eyes narrowing in the fading light. "Listen, Ashley," she said. "You're not planning to keep this place all to yourself, are you? That's absurd. You've never been good with money. You struggled after college, remember? This is too big for you. I've been thinking it would be best if you gave me power of attorney. I can handle the bills, the taxes, the paperwork. You won't have to worry about a thing." Jessica nodded beside her, smiling like the perfect accomplice. My stomach twisted, anger flaring hot under my skin. I forced my face into neutrality, my voice steady. "I've already spoken to Catherine Reed. Everything is in a trust, and I'm the sole trustee. I've got it under control." For a moment, silence thickened the room. Then Linda's lips curled into a dismissive smile. A lawyer? Ashley, those people will bleed you dry. Family looks out for family. I held her gaze, refusing to shrink. I'll think about it, I said flatly, though inside, my decision was already made. This was my grandfather's legacy, and I wasn't about to hand it over. That night, I lay in my bedroom, listening to the faint murmur of my mother and Jessica talking downstairs, their voices low, conspiratorial. I stared at the ceiling, the moonlight casting fractured shadows on the quilt my grandfather had tucked around me when I was a child. I knew then, the fight had only just begun. If you had asked me a year earlier what family conflict looked like, I might have imagined tense holiday dinners or a few icy phone calls. Never in my worst thoughts had I pictured myself standing on the porch of Fern Hill, facing down my sister and strangers she'd hired, my grandfather's legacy hanging in the balance. The days after my mother's arrival were quiet but heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. Linda eventually returned to Boston, her parting words promising we'd discuss things further. Jessica drifted back to New York, leaving behind half-drunk mugs of coffee and the faint stench of her perfume. I tried to find peace in repairing small things, patching walls, cleaning out closets, fixing squeaky hinges. But the sense of something looming never left me. It was early on a Saturday morning when it happened. I was in the kitchen making pancakes, a ritual my grandfather William had always insisted on. The sky outside was flat gray, the kind of sky that threatened snow but didn't deliver. When I glanced through the window, my heart nearly stopped. A moving truck rumbled up the gravel driveway, followed closely by Jessica's sleek car. Two men in work boots jumped down, stretching and laughing like they were about to start an ordinary job. But nothing about this was ordinary. Jessica stepped out next, dressed like she was attending a board meeting, pressed slacks, sunglasses despite the gloom, and a smile that chilled me to the bone. Ashley, she called brightly, as if she'd just stopped by for coffee. Good morning. I brought some help. I went to the front door, my stomach sinking. She didn't wait for permission. She waved the movers forward, and they started up the steps with heavy boxes in hand. Hold on, I said sharply, planting myself in the doorway. What's going on? Jessica pulled a manila envelope from her bag and held it up with theatrical confidence. I've got paperwork. Everything's been sorted. Mom and I found a lawyer who confirmed it. This estate should have been shared between us. Not just you. So we're moving things along before the official transfer. She shoved the papers into my hands. My fingers shook as I skimmed them. Even before I finished, I could see the problems. Signatures that didn't match, notary stamps crooked and blurred, no county seal. It looked like something thrown together by someone who watched too many legal dramas. This is a joke, I said, holding the pages out. You expect me to believe this is real? Jessica's smile didn't waver. It doesn't matter what you believe. The movers have orders. This house is ours. You can call your lawyer if you want, but you'll just be wasting your time. The men hesitated, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to argue with the person paying them. They tried to edge past me. My pulse thundered, but I planted myself firmly in the doorway. No one moves a thing, I said, my voice shaking but strong. This house is mine. The trust is legal and binding. If you don't stop right now, I'll call the sheriff. Jessica's expression hardened, her voice dropping to a hiss meant only for me. You won't do it. You never fight back. You never have. But something in me shifted in that moment. I pulled out my phone and dialed Catherine Reed. She answered on the first ring, her calm voice like an anchor. As I explained the situation, she told me firmly, "Don't let them touch anything. I'll contact the county clerk. Someone will be there soon." I hung up and faced my sister again. The lawyer's on her way. So is the county. If you don't leave now, you'll have to explain those papers to the authorities. For a heartbeat, Jessica faltered. Then her confidence snapped back, brittle and sharp. Fine, she spat. Let's wait. The movers hovered on the porch, smoking cigarettes, pretending not to hear the argument. Jessica paced the living room like a caged animal, muttering, sending furious texts. I sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, staring at the clock, each second dragging like a year. When a county official finally arrived, Michael Harris, I almost cried with relief. Catherine followed close behind. She scanned the forged documents, sighed, and shook her head. "These aren't worth the paper they're printed on," she told Jessica. "Do you understand this is a felony?" Michael Harris compared the documents with the originals I had carefully saved. His voice was stern. "The trust stands. If you don't leave the premises immediately, law enforcement will be involved." Jessica's face drained of color. She tried to bluster, insisting she was just looking out for family interests, but nobody was convinced. The movers, realizing they'd been duped, quietly packed their truck and drove away without another word. And then, as if on cue, Linda stormed in through the front door. Her face was set in a mask of rage. "Ashley," she shouted, "how could you do this? You're tearing this family apart. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" Her words struck like knives, but I stood my ground. "This was Grandpa's decision," I said firmly. "He trusted me with this house, with his legacy. You can scream all you want, but the will is clear." Linda's voice rose to a shriek, threatening lawsuits, promising to drag my name through the mud. But Catherine cut in, her calm presence slicing through the chaos. "You're welcome to contest in court, Linda, but you have no case. If this harassment continues, we'll pursue legal action." The fight ended with slammed doors and searing glares. Jessica retreated to her car, Linda trailing after, vowing I would regret this. I stood on the porch, trembling as their car disappeared down the drive. Tears stung my eyes, not because I doubted myself, but because the two people who should have loved me most had tried to steal everything from me. When their cars finally vanished down the driveway, I sank onto the porch steps and let the tears come. It wasn't regret. I didn't regret standing up to them. It was grief, sharp and bitter, because the people who were supposed to protect me had turned into the ones trying hardest to break me.
But the storm didn't end that day.
My mother, Linda, wasted no time launching a campaign against me. She called cousins, distant relatives, even old family friends, spinning her version of events. In her telling, I had manipulated my grandfather into leaving me everything, tricked him in his old age, and cut everyone else out. She painted herself as the victim and me as the selfish betrayer. The phone rang constantly. Some messages were sharp and accusing. Cold voices I had once called family, asking how I could be so cruel. Others were quieter, confused, asking for my side of the story. Most chose silence, unwilling to take sides. The house, already full of memories, now felt heavier, its walls echoing with gossip carried on invisible lines. I tried to ignore it, focusing on repairs, on small victories like fixing a squeaky door or planting flowers out back. But the rumors found their way to me anyway. It was like standing in the center of a storm where every gust carried whispers of betrayal. Meanwhile, Jessica had her own unraveling to face. Desperate and reckless, she tried to use the forged documents again, this time in New York. She attempted to secure a loan by presenting them as proof of shared inheritance. But the bank did its due diligence, and the fraud surfaced almost immediately. Within weeks, she was staring down criminal charges. I didn't hear it from Jessica herself. It was Catherine Reed, my lawyer, who called to warn me. Her voice was steady but concerned. "Ashley, your sister's choices might cause noise, but legally, you're safe. The trust holds. Just be prepared. Things may get uglier for her." News spread quickly. Jessica lost her job, her reputation cracked, and friends who once orbited her ambition began to vanish. I should have felt triumph. After all, she had tried to strip me of everything. But instead, what I felt was complicated. There was anger, yes, but also pity. Beneath it all, there was relief, because for the first time since the inheritance began, I wasn't afraid anymore. As for my mother, her campaign began to falter. The more relatives realized her claims were baseless, the less power her words carried. One by one, people stopped returning her calls. Her voice grew quieter, though never gone. I knew she still carried her bitterness like a badge. The noise around me slowly dulled, replaced by the sounds of the house itself, floorboards creaking, wind pressing against the windows, the faint hum of the radiators. Fernhill was no longer just a battleground. It was becoming something else. A sanctuary. Winter gave way to spring, and with it, a quiet I had never known before. The chaos faded, not all at once, but in pieces, like a storm breaking apart into scattered clouds. For the first time in months, I could breathe without bracing myself for the next phone call, the next accusation, the next ambush at my door. The trust my grandfather William had set up remained intact, now worth about $350,000 after years of careful saving. It gave me breathing room. I didn't have to worry about the heating bill or whether the roof repair would break me. For the first time in my adult life, I could choose what kind of work I wanted instead of chasing paychecks just to survive. I began volunteering at the local library in town. It started with one afternoon a week, reading stories to children, helping older neighbors figure out computers. Soon it became something steady, something that gave my days structure and warmth. The library's director, Pauline, was quick-witted and kind. Over lunches in the break room, she listened to my stories about Fernhill, about my grandfather, about the battles I'd fought to keep his legacy safe. She never judged. She just nodded, smiled, and gently guided the conversation toward books and futures, not wounds. At home, I threw myself into restoring the house. Every small repair felt like an act of healing, for me and for the place. I patched the roof over the kitchen with the help of YouTube videos and advice from an elderly neighbor named June, who brought over cookies and told me her own horror stories about leaky pipes. Weekends were for the garden. I found my grandfather's tools in the shed, neatly labeled in his careful script. With every weed I pulled, with every seed I planted, I felt his presence, not as a ghost, but as a steady encouragement in my bones. I planted rows of sunflowers along the back fence, their faces always turned to the light. Inside, I repainted shutters a soft blue, hung new curtains in the parlor, fixed the rickety steps on the back porch. Slowly, the house began to feel less like a fortress under siege and more like a home. But even in peace, doubts crept in. At night, lying under the quilt, I sometimes wondered if I had destroyed the last threads of my family just to save a house. My mother, Linda, still sent emails now and then, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, often both. She demanded her share, accused me of forgetting where I came from. At first, I tried to answer, to explain. But I quickly realized there was nothing I could say that would change her story. Jessica, meanwhile, disappeared almost entirely. After her arrest, she seemed to vanish into the folds of New York's endless skyline. Once or twice, bitter texts arrived, accusing me of betrayal, of abandoning family loyalty. Then even those stopped. I heard through acquaintances that she'd taken a job in London, trying to rebuild her name across the ocean. The house on Fernhill grew quieter, but it was no longer a lonely quiet. It was a peace I hadn't known I needed. By late summer, Fernhill felt transformed, not just in paint and patchwork, but in spirit. Where once I heard echoes of conflict, I now heard birdsong through open windows, the creak of floorboards softened by familiarity, the hum of a house that finally felt alive again. Each morning began with coffee in the sunroom, the glass catching the first pink light over the Vermont hills. I would sit wrapped in my grandfather William's old flannel robe, letting the warmth soak in as I watched squirrels dart across the fence and deer nose through the garden. For so long, my life had been shaped by other people's demands, my mother's criticism, Jessica's ambition, even the customers at the bookstore. Now, for the first time, there was only my own voice. And that voice asked one question again and again. What do you want? I discovered answers slowly. I wanted healing. I wanted to choose peace over chaos. I wanted to create a life that honored my grandfather's trust in me. The house became part of that healing. Each time I fixed a crack in the plaster, each time I scrubbed years of dust from an old window, I felt as if I were also mending something inside myself. Friends began to visit for dinner. The old dining table, scarred by decades of meals, filled again with laughter, flickering candles, and the comfort of chosen company. I realized family didn't always mean blood. It could mean the people who showed up, who listened, who stayed. Still, there were nights when guilt tried to creep back in. When my mother's angry emails or the memory of Jessica's betrayal tugged at old wounds. But I learned to treat those feelings like weather, passing storms I didn't have to obey.
I had boundaries now.
I had strength. And I had freedom. One evening, I stood at the edge of the garden, the rows of sunflowers nodding in the warm breeze, and felt a joy so quiet it startled me. Not the dramatic kind of joy books and movies promised. A softer joy, built from the hum of bees, the smell of earth, the distant laughter of children playing nearby. For the first time in years, I wasn't fighting. I wasn't running. I was simply living. The trust fund remained, not just as financial security, worth $350,000, but as a symbol of my grandfather's unwavering belief in me. He hadn't chosen me out of convenience. He had seen something in me I was only just learning to see in myself. In the end, it was never really about the money or the property. It was about knowing my worth, about protecting what mattered, about choosing myself. The silence that settled over Fern Hill was no longer heavy, no longer lonely. It was a fullness, the sound of a life rebuilt from the inside out, a freedom hard-won and fiercely protected. And every morning, as the sun rose over the Vermont hills, I knew with absolute certainty I was exactly where I was meant to be. This is my story. I faced betrayal from the very people who were supposed to love me the most. They tried to take everything from me, but I refused to surrender. I chose to fight. I chose to protect my grandfather's trust, and in the end, I chose myself. Today, Fern Hill is more than just a house. It is my freedom, my strength, and my revenge. You've been watching my journey here on Revenge Repeat. If my story moved you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because here, every story proves that no matter how cruel the betrayal, strength and justice always rise again.